The wind that night in 1945 carried more than just the scent of pine and fresh snow. It carried the smell of smoke, the sound of screams, and the terrible silence of a mystery that would consume a family for the next half-century. This is the case of the Sodder children, a true crime saga that remains one of the most perplexing and heartbreaking unsolved disappearances in American history. It began on Christmas Eve, a time of warmth, family, and joy in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. A night that should have been filled with laughter, but instead ended in catastrophic fire and inexplicable loss. 5 young souls vanished without a trace, swallowed not by the flames, but by a chilling uncertainty that persists to this very day. Imagine the impossible. A fire engulfs your home, trapping your children inside. Yet after the blaze is extinguished, the police find no bodies, no remains, no definitive proof that they ever perished. This is not the plot of a fictional thriller, but the devastating reality that George and Jenny Sodder were forced to confront. The official conclusion was simple, brutal, and ultimately profoundly wrong. The children burned to ashes, their remains completely consumed by the heat. But the evidence that accumulated over the following days, months, and years painted a radically different picture, suggesting not a tragic accident, but a sinister plot, a kidnapping executed under the cover of a holiday inferno. Tonight, we will peel back the layers of this baffling case, examining the disturbing anomalies that the initial investigation chose to ignore. We will look at the faulty phone lines, the trucks that mysteriously refused to start, the strange object found far from the fire, and the stunning testimony of witnesses who claimed they saw the missing children long after they were officially pronounced dead. We will follow the desperate, multi-million-dollar search waged by George and Jenny, a couple who refused to accept the finality of death without concrete proof, and whose tireless pursuit of the truth turned them into national figures. We are diving into the heart of the enigma, exploring the possibility of organized crime, an old-world vendetta, or perhaps even human trafficking, all fueled by the relentless belief that the Sodder children, Martha, Jenny, Betty, Louis, and Maurice, did not die in that fire, but were taken. We will confront the photograph that surfaced 20 years later, a single image that offered a blinding flash of hope and a final, crushing betrayal. Prepare yourself for a journey into the deepest shadows of a Christmas miracle that never came, and a promise that was never fulfilled. This is the definitive account of the family that vanished, and the $1 million clue that failed to bring them home. The patriarch of this unfortunate family was George Sodder, a man whose life story began far across the Atlantic, carrying the weight of European history and the ambition of the American dream. George was born Giorgio Soddu in a small village on the Italian island of Sardinia in 1895. He emigrated to the United States as a boy of 13, a move he would later describe as an escape from the potential of being forced into military service in the Italian army, a prospect he greatly feared. Upon arriving in America, he did what many immigrants did, anglicizing his name to George Sodder to better fit into his new home. George settled initially in the bustling state of Pennsylvania, where he found work on the railroads, hard manual labor that instilled in him a powerful work ethic and a deep appreciation for industry. He later moved to Smithers, West Virginia, finding a more stable and prosperous life as a truck driver, and then later establishing his own successful trucking company, focusing on hauling coal for local mining operations. George was known in the community as a respectable, well-off businessman, a self-made man who had achieved success through sheer grit and determination. He was a man of strong opinions, often outspoken about local politics, and rumored to have had long-standing, volatile disagreements with certain individuals regarding his candid views. His wife, Jenny Cipriani Sodder, was the exact opposite, a woman born into an Italian-American family in West Virginia itself. She was known for her gentle nature, her warmth, and her deep devotion to her growing family. Jenny was the anchor of the Sodder home, raising the children with kindness and an unvarying sense of routine and order. She and George eventually had 10 children together, a massive, lively family that was the centerpiece of their lives. At the time of the fire in 1945, 2 of their older children, the 2 oldest sons, had already left the family home to serve in the U.S. military during World War II, leaving 8 children still residing with George and Jenny. The 5 children, who would tragically vanish that night, were the youngest: Morris, aged 14, Martha, aged 12, Louis, aged 10, Jenny, aged 8, and Betty, aged 5. The other 3 children, John, Marianne, and Sylvia, were accounted for during and after the fire, but their lives, and the lives of George and Jenny, would be forever defined by the absence of their 5 siblings. The Sodder family was deeply rooted in the Italian Catholic community of Fayetteville, though George himself held a somewhat anti-religious view, a stance that sometimes led to friction within the town. He was particularly critical of the fascist government of Benito Mussolini back in Italy, a fact that he did not hide. It was this outspoken nature, combined with his immigrant background and business success, that some later speculated might have drawn unwanted attention to the family, perhaps even setting the stage for the catastrophic events that would unfold on that cold Christmas Eve. Their home, a large 2-story house situated just outside the main town, was usually a hub of activity, filled with the joy, noise, and chaos that only a family of 12 could generate. A scene of domestic bliss that was about to be utterly destroyed, leaving behind nothing but smoke, ash, and an agonizing question mark. The setting for this dark Christmas tale was Fayetteville, West Virginia, a quaint, tight-knit mining community nestled within the rugged forested terrain of the Appalachian Mountains. In the mid-1940s, Fayetteville was typical of many small American towns where everyone knew everyone, and local life revolved around a few key social structures and the rhythms of the coal industry. This sense of closeness, however, often came with a downside: an insular environment where old grudges and strong opinions could fester, and where any deviation from the norm, such as George Sodder's outspoken nature, was easily noticed and potentially resented. George Sodder's success in the trucking and hauling business was significant in this economy, marking him as a prominent, yet perhaps controversial figure. His candid criticism of the fascist regime in Italy, particularly strong due to his heritage, was unusual for the area, and, according to some family accounts, drew the ire of local individuals with possible connections to organized crime or old-world ideological conflicts. This background detail is critical because the Sodder family later believed their tragedy was not random, but a direct consequence of George's political and professional stances, a veiled threat that escalated into devastating action. Their family home, situated on the outskirts of Fayetteville, was a large 2-story wooden structure, a symbol of their hard-earned prosperity. It was not a modest miner's cottage, but a substantial house capable of comfortably accommodating George, Jenny, and their 8 children. The house was built in a style common to the region, relying on timber for construction, which, while aesthetically pleasing, also presented a significant fire risk. The main floor was dominated by a living area and kitchen, while the second floor held the bedrooms where the children slept. One of the key features of the house, which would later become a focal point of the mystery, was its dependency on the local utilities and infrastructure. The house was supplied with electricity, but the fire would soon reveal vulnerabilities in the system. George Sodder was known to be meticulous about his property, including the maintenance of the vehicles crucial to his business, which were often parked near the house. This attention to detail further emphasized the highly unusual and inexplicable failures of mechanical and electrical systems during the crucial moments of the fire. The location of the house also played a role in the lack of immediate help. Being somewhat removed from the center of town meant that when the fire broke out, the initial screams and the sight of the flames were not immediately visible or audible to the bulk of the town's residents or the volunteer fire department. This geographical isolation contributed directly to the critical delay in the response, transforming a potentially contained structure fire into a total loss. The cold of December 24th, 1945, set a harsh scene, ensuring that the snow-dusted woods and fields surrounding the Sodder home provided a stark, beautiful, yet ultimately unforgiving backdrop to the unimaginable horror that was about to unfold, leaving the family to battle the raging inferno in terrifying solitude for far too long. The events of that terrifying night began subtly, as all great tragedies often do. Christmas Eve was a festive but tiring day for the Sodder family. George and Jenny had worked hard preparing for the holiday, and the children were buzzing with anticipation for Santa's arrival. Around 7:30 that evening, the younger children, Martha, Jenny, Betty, Louis, and Maurice, asked their mother Jenny if they could stay up later than usual. Normally, they would be strictly ushered to bed. But on this special night, Jenny relented. The older sister, Marion, age 17, was going out that evening to attend a late-night Christmas service with friends. Maurice, the oldest of the 5 missing children, and his younger brother Louis were in a particularly boisterous mood, playing with 2 small toy cannons George had recently purchased, simple gifts that would become part of the night's dark history. When Marion left for the service, the 5 younger children were still awake, playing happily. George and Jenny retired to their own bedroom on the first floor around 10 o'clock, assuming the children would soon follow suit. The oldest remaining son, John, age 23, who was home on leave from the military, was already asleep in another first-floor bedroom. George and Jenny settled in, believing the house was quieting down and anticipating the holiday morning. But just before 10:30, an unusual noise interrupted the Christmas quiet. Jenny was abruptly awakened by the distinct, sharp sound of something hitting the roof of the house. She later described it as a loud thud, followed by a rolling noise, as if an object had struck the peak and rolled down to the gutter. Curious and slightly alarmed, Jenny got up to investigate. She went outside, turning on the lights, but saw nothing unusual. Everything seemed normal. The snow-dusted roof, the quiet yard, and the Christmas lights gently blinking in the cold. She concluded it must have been a stray limb, or perhaps a bit of ice falling from the roof. As Jenny went back inside, she noticed one critical detail. The lights in the children's second-floor bedroom were still on. The children were supposed to have been asleep hours ago. When she went upstairs to check on them, she found Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty tucked into bed. They were fast asleep, but the lights had been left on. Jenny simply turned off the light and went back downstairs to bed. The thud, the rolling noise, and the strange discovery of the children asleep with the lights on. These were the first subtle, seemingly innocent signs that something profoundly wrong was already in motion. Jenny's brief moment of alarm quickly subsided, and she returned to her slumber, unaware that the quiet she experienced was the calm before an unimaginable storm. The mystery surrounding the initial noise would later become a key piece of the kidnapping theory, suggesting an object, perhaps an incendiary device or something meant to distract, had been deliberately thrown onto the roof to initiate the night's horrifying sequence of events. The second interruption of the night, occurring approximately 45 minutes after the mysterious thud on the roof, was far more bizarre and unsettling than the first. Sometime after midnight, around 12:30 a.m., the telephone rang loudly, jolting Jenny out of a deep sleep once more. This was highly unusual for the time of night in their quiet town, and Jenny hurried to answer the call, finding a strange woman's voice on the other end of the line. The woman's voice was unfamiliar, yet strangely insistent, asking for a person Jenny did not know. The caller spoke in a frenzied, panicked manner, her voice interspersed with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses, suggesting she might have been calling from a party or a bar. Jenny tried to explain that the number was incorrect and that there was no such person at the Sodder residence. However, the woman's strange persistence continued, questioning Jenny's identification and repeatedly asking for the unknown person. This odd, brief exchange was punctuated by a sinister sound in the background, a distinct, harsh, and loud laugh that Jenny later identified as an adult man's mocking guffaw. The call lasted only a few minutes before the strange woman hung up abruptly, leaving Jenny deeply confused and slightly unnerved by the interaction and the unsettling laughter she had heard. Exhausted and wishing to return to sleep, Jenny walked back toward her bedroom. It was then, as she crossed the main living area, that she noticed something else profoundly disturbing. The front door of the house, which she and George always diligently locked before going to bed, was now wide open. Not only that, but the lights in the downstairs living room, which she had extinguished earlier, were back on, illuminating the room in an unnatural glory. Feeling a surge of fear mixed with annoyance at the disruption, Jenny went to the open front door and secured the lock firmly. She also turned off the lights and, without waking George, returned to bed, trying to dismiss the strange phone call and the open door as random, unlinked occurrences. This phone call, however, would later become an indispensable and damning piece of evidence for the Sodder family's theory of kidnapping and premeditation. It suggested that the purpose of the call was not a simple wrong number, but rather a calculated distraction, drawing Jenny's attention away from the real action taking place elsewhere in the house. The strange laughter, the open door, and the unusual timing all pointed towards an orchestrated attempt to monitor the house, confirm the movements of the adults, and execute a planned invasion. The call served as a psychological wedge, subtly raising Jenny's alarm just enough to pull her out of bed and into the living space, making her movements predictable for anyone observing or operating inside the house. This momentary lapse of security, facilitated by the strange caller, provided the kidnappers with the window of opportunity they needed to either survey the house or, chillingly, to begin preparing the structure for the destruction that was soon to follow. A destruction meant to erase the evidence of their crime. Only about a half hour after the strange phone call and the discovery of the open front door, at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, Jenny Sodder was awakened a third and final time, this time by a smell that was unmistakable and instantly terrifying: the pungent odor of smoke. This was not the faint, lingering smell of a chimney fire or an old wood stove, but the acrid, heavy smell of a structure actively burning. Alarmed, Jenny immediately woke George, urging him to get up and investigate the source of the smoke. George was usually a sound sleeper, but the intensity of the smoke quickly brought him to full alertness. They both realized the danger was immediate and severe. George, instinctively rushing to the staircase that led to the second floor where their children slept, found that the main stairwell was already engulfed in heavy black smoke and rapidly climbing flames. The fire was not starting small. It was already raging in the heart of the house, indicating that it must have been burning for some time and building rapidly from the core. The urgency was paramount. George immediately shouted upstairs, a desperate attempt to rouse the 5 children trapped in the bedrooms above. He was met only by the terrifying roar of the fire and the crackling of wood. Simultaneously, Jenny raced to the bedroom shared by the 2 eldest children who were still home: John, the military son, and Marion, the daughter who had recently returned from the Christmas service. She successfully woke them, and another daughter, Sylvia, who was in a different downstairs bedroom. George and Jenny, along with the 3 successfully rescued children, realized they had mere moments to escape. They rushed out of the burning house through a first-floor back door, narrowly escaping the rapidly spreading flames. Once outside in the cold night air, the terrible count by George, Jenny, John, Marion, and Sylvia. Only 5 of them. The other 5, Morris, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were still trapped upstairs, with the fire blocking the only internal escape route. The reality was a crushing blow. The heart of their large family was still inside the inferno. Standing outside in the snow, watching their home burned, George and Jenny were momentarily paralyzed by panic and desperation. The fire was progressing with shocking speed, an observation that would later fuel their skepticism. Jenny, in particular, noted the unusual intensity of the blaze, realizing the critical window for escape was closing faster than a typical house fire would allow. The fire appeared to be consuming the wooden structure with an unnerving, almost unnatural ferocity, making any immediate, direct rescue attempt nearly suicidal. The entire second floor was rapidly transforming into a chaotic mass of flames, smoke, and the sound of shattering glass, making the fate of the 5 children inside a horrifying, immediate concern that demanded reckless action. Realizing the children were trapped upstairs, and the main stairwell was already a raging chute of fire, George Sodder's immediate instinct was to attempt an unsuccessful rescue. He ordered the older children, John and Marion, to remain safely outside with Jenny and Sylvia. He then frantically rushed to the side of the house, where he knew there was a ladder, a tool he relied on for house maintenance. However, in a shocking, almost unbelievable twist of fate, the ladder was missing from its usual spot. It was normally propped against the side of the house, easily accessible. The inability to find the ladder instantly hampered his plan, robbing him of precious minutes in the face of the rapidly accelerating fire. Undeterred by this setback, George quickly switched tactics. He ran to the side of the house, where the children's second-floor bedroom window was visible. He planned to break the window, and then use his own substantial strength and agility to climb up, smash through the glass, and somehow pull the children out to safety. He threw large rocks and anything he could find at the windows, hoping to gain access to these. But the windows remained stubbornly entwined, resisting the impact. Failing at the windows, George turned his attention to his work vehicles, desperate for a tool, a rope, or even a means of knocking down the wall itself. The Sodder family owned 2 large coal trucks, powerful vehicles essential to George's business, which were parked nearby and were crucial to their livelihood. George attempted to start the first truck, a large dump truck, believing he could drive it up to the house and use it as an impromptu platform to reach the second-floor window. He turned the ignition key, expecting the reliable engine to roar to life, but the truck, which had been operating perfectly fine just hours before, completely failed to start. He tried again and again, but the engine simply turned over with a weak, lifeless cough. In a state of near frenzy, George abandoned the first vehicle and rushed to the second truck, an even larger, newer model that he had purchased recently. He inserted the key, praying this one would work. But to his utter shock and devastation, the second truck also refused to start. Both trucks, maintained meticulously and rarely if ever giving him trouble, were inexplicably and simultaneously disabled at the most critical moment of his way. This double failure was not just a piece of bad luck. For George, it was the first deeply unsettling indication that the fire was not an accident and that someone had deliberately interfered with his ability to rescue his children. The critical minutes lost trying to start the trucks and locate the missing ladder sealed the fate of the 5 children still inside. The upper floor was now completely engulfed, and the fire's intensity made any further direct rescue attempt utterly impossible. Standing helplessly outside, George, Jenny, and the 3 older children watched as the flames completely consumed the upper floor of their home. The immediate attempts at rescue were thwarted by the missing ladder and the inexplicable failure of both powerful work trucks, creating a sense of profound, crippling helplessness. The fire, fed by the wooden structure and fueled, the family later suspected, by some form of accelerant, was now an uncontrollable inferno. With direct action impossible, the next desperate step was to call for help. The children, Marion and John, ran to a neighbor's house to call the volunteer fire department, which was located several miles away in the center of Fayetteville. However, this simple act of calling for assistance was also met with baffling complications. They found that their home telephone line, which had just received that strange, unsettling call hours earlier, was now dead. This technical failure meant the crucial minutes needed for the fire department to mobilize were further extended by the need to physically travel to a neighbor's house to place the call. The Fayetteville Volunteer Fire Department was not a professional 24-hour service. It was staffed entirely by local men who had to be contacted individually and then travel from their homes and places of work to the station before they could even attempt to drive the fire truck to the scene. This inherent structure meant that any emergency response was bound to be delayed. But the sequence of failures, the non-functioning trucks, the dead phone line, the missing ladder, exacerbated the delay into a fatal gap. When the call finally went through, the fire chief, F.J. Morris, received the report. However, for reasons that remain ambiguous and highly criticized, the response was not immediate. The fire department's response time was tragically slow, with the first fire truck not arriving at the scene until approximately 8 hours after the fire had begun, well into the next morning. By the time Chief Morris and his crew reached the Sodder property, the two-story house was completely leveled. All that remained was a smoldering pile of ash and debris, glowing faintly in the pre-dawn light. There was no fire left to fight, only the devastating aftermath to sift through. The lack of immediate, robust equipment and the crippling delays were critical factors that later fueled George and Jenny's suspicion. Had the latter been in place, had the truck started, had the phone line worked, George could have perhaps reached the children in the initial moments of the blaze. The cumulative impact of these strange failures transformed a house fire into a mass disappearance, laying the foundation for the family's lifelong quest to prove that the children were not victims of the fire, but of a calculated, cold-blooded crime executed with unnerving precision and preparation. The inability of the local infrastructure to provide basic, reliable assistance in the most urgent of moments became a bitter, enduring symbol of the system's failure to protect their children. The arrival of the Fayetteville Volunteer Fire Department was marked by an almost unbelievable delay, a factor that only deepened the Sodder family's later conviction that the system had fundamentally failed them. Fire Chief F.J. Morris, the man responsible for the department, was initially alerted to the fire by the telephone calls placed by the neighbors, but the precise timing of his notification and his subsequent actions were immediately called into question. It was reported that Chief Morris did not drive directly to the station to retrieve the fire truck. Instead, he claimed he attempted to call George Sodder first on the phone, only to find the line dead, despite the fact that the alarm was raised via a working neighbor's phone. When Morris finally mobilized his team, the fire truck itself presented a critical, almost symbolic problem. It was an older model, requiring manual intervention before it could be started, a delay that might have been manageable in a small emergency, but proved catastrophic in a raging structure fire. By the time the fire truck finally began its slow journey toward the Sodder home, the fire had been burning for hours, reaching its maximum intensity and beginning the process of collapse. The distance from the center of Fayetteville to the Sodder residence meant a drive of several miles, further compounding the lost time. When the fire department finally pulled up to the desolate scene, the sun was already rising on Christmas morning. The structure was no more. The large two-story house had been reduced to a heap of smoking debris and smoldering timbers. There was simply nothing left for the firefighters to extinguish. Chief Morris and his crew, faced with the complete destruction of the home, were forced to stand by, watching the final wisps of smoke dissipate in the cold morning air. This devastating delay meant that the fire was not fought. It simply burned itself out. For George and Jenny, the fire department's response was an inexcusable act of negligence, bordering on outright suspicion. They argued bitterly that a more rapid response, even with the aging equipment, could have at least allowed the firefighters to breach the remaining sections of the house or attempt an extraction. The 8-hour gap between the initial alarm and the fire truck's arrival left the family with the sickening certainty that a crucial opportunity had been lost. Chief Morris's defense was centered on the volunteer nature of the service and the inherent delays in calling out the men. But for the Sodders, the simultaneous failure of 2 reliable trucks, a functioning phone line, and a prompt fire response was far too much coincidence. The sheer lack of urgency from the fire chief, coupled with the systemic failures, became an early cornerstone of the Sodder family's belief that the tragedy was not an accident, but a premeditated, well-covered-up crime, enabled by an inadequately equipped and perhaps indifferent local infrastructure. The morning of Christmas Day, 1945, dawned cold and somber over the ruins of the Sodder home. The 2-story structure was gone, replaced by a smoking cellar pit filled with charred debris. The immediate, heartbreaking priority was the search for the 5 missing children: Morris, Martha, Louise, Jenny, and Betty. George Sodder, along with the fire chief F.J. Morris and a few neighbors, began the grim task of sifting through the wreckage. The expectation, universally held by the outside authorities, was that they would find the skeletal remains of the 5 children. A fire of such intensity, lasting for several hours, was expected to leave behind evidence bones, or at the very least, fragments of bone that would confirm the children's tragic deaths. However, as the men painstakingly worked through the debris, shoveling and turning over the heavy ash, they found nothing. Hour after hour, they searched the entire perimeter of the collapsed structure, focusing particularly on the areas where the children's bedrooms were located. But the search yielded a shocking emptiness. No bones, no teeth, no trace of the human body were recovered. By mid-morning, Fire Chief Morris made an immediate and highly controversial declaration. He concluded, without having found any physical evidence, that the bodies must have been completely incinerated in the extremely hot blaze, their remains vaporized into ash. He informed George and Jenny that the 5 children were dead, the fire being the cause. This swift conclusion, reached within a few hours and based entirely on a lack of evidence rather than the presence of it, was the first major step taken by the authorities to close the case. The official statement, issued by the local authorities, was tragically concise. The Sodder children perished in the fire. Death certificates were issued quickly, with the cause of death officially listed as fire or suffocation. The speed and certainty with which Chief Morris reached this verdict, despite the unprecedented absence of human remains, baffled and enraged George Sodder. George, a man with a sharp, practical mind, questioned how a fire that left behind the entire house's timber structure, electrical wiring, and the metal coils of the mattresses intact could have utterly destroyed 5 human bodies, which are substantially denser and harder to burn completely. This governmental declaration, intended to bring closure, only served to ignite George and Jenny's suspicion and fueled their lifelong belief that their children had been taken, not burned. The ashes were not a graffiti. They were a clean slate, a blank canvas upon which the greatest mystery of their lives was written. The swift and unsupported declaration by Fire Chief Morris that the children had been completely consumed by the blaze was met by George Sodder with immediate and powerful resistance. George, a successful businessman, known for his logical mind and strong opinions, refused to accept a conclusion based solely on the absence of evidence. He understood, perhaps better than the local authorities, the physical realities of a fire. He argued vehemently that the temperature required to utterly incinerate 5 human bodies, reducing them to nothing but vapor, was astronomically high, likely exceeding 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than what a typical house fire, even one of several hours, could generate. George pointed to the surviving evidence right in the cellar pit as irrefutable proof of his skepticism. He noted that the heavy cast-iron wood stove in the kitchen, a massive piece of equipment, was still largely intact amidst the ashes. Crucially, the metal wiring of the beds and the springs of the children's mattresses, which were on the second floor, were all recovered in the debris, warped but still identifiable. George's logical question was this: how could a fire so intensely hot that it vaporized 5 human bodies, dense structures of bone and flesh, fail to completely destroy the metallic springs and coils of the beds they slept in? To George, the persistence of these metal objects, along with the very structure of the house's foundation, was a devastating indictment of the chief's quick conclusion. Jenny Sodder's reaction was rooted more in instinct and emotion, yet equally certain. She later became consumed by the search for physical evidence of the children's remains. Her focus was on the earth beneath the ruins. She realized that the fire had not burned long enough or hot enough to significantly change the color of the soil under the house where the furnace was located. She stated that if the children's bodies had truly been incinerated into fine ash, that ash should have mixed with the dirt, leaving a visible layer of darkened or reddish soil in the cellar area. Yet, when she excavated the ground around the foundation herself, the soil remained largely undisturbed, displaying its natural color, providing another profound piece of circumstantial evidence that no bodies had been consumed there. The Sodders' active resistance extended beyond mere questioning. They actively fought the authorities' attempts to close the case. George and Jenny repeatedly refused to believe the death certificates, preventing any attempt to formally bury the victims without physical remains. They became public figures in their own small tragedy, using George's financial resources and business acumen to wage a personal war against the official narrative. Their refusal to mourn, their insistence on the impossibility of the official conclusion, and their public challenging of Chief Morris's competence led to a bitter, long-running feud with the local authorities. This confrontation was not just about finding answers. It was about protecting the legacy of their missing children, refusing to allow them to be dismissed as mere victims of an accident, and preserving the hope, however slim, that they were still alive. Their deep, visceral rejection of the burn-to-ashes theory became the driving force of the entire investigation, transforming the case from a local tragedy into a national obsession that demanded proof where only assumption existed. The local investigation into the Sodder fire and the disappearance of the 5 children was characterized by haste, negligence, and a troubling willingness to accept the most convenient conclusion. The primary investigator, Fire Chief F.J. Morris, lacked the formal training and objective distance required for a case of this magnitude, leading to critical errors in the crucial initial hours. Instead of preserving the scene for a meticulous forensic examination, Morris quickly bulldozed the ashes and debris, essentially turning the site of the tragedy into a shallow grave and destroying any delicate physical evidence that might have proved or disproved George's theory. This rash action, done under the guise of an immediate cleanup, was the first catastrophic mistake that permanently handicapped the investigation. The immediate assumptions made by the local authorities concerning the cause of the fire were based on the simplest explanation, which in this case was dismissed by George Sodder. The official cause was vaguely attributed to faulty wiring or a defective chimney flue. George vehemently rejected this, arguing that the house had recently been inspected and the wiring was new. Furthermore, the fire began not in the chimney area, but near the roofline and the telephone wire entrance, an area that George pointed to as the likely point of entry for an incendiary device or sabotage. He maintained that the mysterious thud and rolling noise on the roof, heard by Jenny just before the fire, was a key indicator of a pre-planned attack using a heat-generating object. Several key anomalies that the local police and fire department quickly brushed aside would become the focal points of the Sodders' decades-long private investigation. Firstly, the telephone line being cut. George later discovered that the phone wire running from the pole to the house had been neatly cut, not burned, and the cut occurred well out of reach, suggesting deliberate, premeditated sabotage. This evidence, which directly contradicted the faulty wiring theory, was noted but dismissed by authorities. Secondly, the failure of the trucks. George's two large, powerful work trucks simultaneously failing to start was, in his view, statistically impossible, and pointed directly to tampering. A mechanic George consulted later suggested that the engines may have been intentionally sabotaged or disabled by foreign objects placed in the fuel lines or electrical system. Thirdly, the missing ladder. The ladder George needed for the upstairs rescue, a large, heavy tool, was inexplicably missing from its usual spot. It was later found several months after the fire, hidden in a deep ravine nearly 75 feet away from the house, a position that strongly suggested it had been deliberately removed and concealed to prevent George's rescue efforts. For the local authorities, these were all coincidences. For George and Jenny, they were the undeniable fingerprints of criminals who had carefully planned every single step of the operation, from starting the fire to disabling the means of rescue and communication. The most damning omission of the entire initial investigation, however, was the complete lack of a serious, systematic search for human remains, relying instead on the highly improbable assumption of total incineration, a convenient fiction that allowed the police to conclude their work within 48 hours of the event, despite the fire chief's insistence that the children's remains had been completely vaporized, an assumption that allowed him to quickly bulldoze the site and close the case. The tragedy gained some national attention, largely due to the Sodders' uncaring public appeals. This pressure eventually led to a more formal, albeit still belated, examination of the scene by state and federal authorities. However, it was not until the following spring, when the ground had thawed and the weather had improved, that a truly unsettling discovery was made, a discovery that directly contradicted the official narrative and reignited the Sodders' hope. In the spring of 1946, George Sodder, still refusing to give up, was painstakingly sifting through the debris in the cellar pit, long after the authorities had abandoned the scene. While meticulously working through the deepest, hottest layers of the rubble, he found a small, dark, rubbery object. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be a human heart, or at least a highly decomposed internal organ, which had been perfectly preserved by the fire's intense heat, or perhaps deliberately placed there. George immediately took this grim discovery to the authorities, who, in a baffling display of indifference, chose to dismiss it. One official simply stated it was an anomaly, possibly an animal organ, and quickly discarded it, losing the only piece of potential biological evidence recovered at the scene. The most shocking and definitive piece of contradictory evidence, however, came years later. In 1949, motivated by the Sodders' continuing vocal public appeals and a small private investigation they had founded, George convinced a state pathologist from a nearby medical college, Dr. Oscar B. Hunter, to conduct a new, more scientific excavation of the fire site. This time the excavation was thorough, extending deep beneath the area where the house had stood. During this professional dig, investigators finally unearthed several small fragments of bone, clearly distinguishable as human remains, deep in the soil. The most significant finding was a few small pieces of vertebrae, human backbones, which were immediately sent to Dr. Hunter's lab for forensic analysis. The results that came back were stunning and devastating. Dr. Hunter's analysis concluded that the small charred bones belonged to a single individual. Crucially, he determined that the bones showed no signs of being exposed to the extreme heat necessary for total incineration. They were merely charred, suggesting they had been buried and exposed to the fire for a minimal amount of time. Furthermore, the pathologist estimated that the bones belonged to a child between the ages of 9 and 15 years old. The profound significance of this finding was twofold. Firstly, it proved that the official declaration of complete incineration was unequivocally false. There were remains at the site, and the authorities were either lying or grossly incompetent. Secondly, and perhaps most devastatingly for the Sodders' peace of mind, the tiny fragments accounted for only one child, and only a very small portion of that child's skeleton. If one child had died in the fire, where were the other 4 children's bodies? And why were the remains found only partially burned, and in such small fragments? This discovery opened the door to a horrifying possibility. Either the children were not in the house when the fire reached its peak, or they were removed beforehand, with only a small partial body, perhaps deliberately planted left, to confirm the official story of death by fire. Despite the shocking forensic evidence unearthed in 1949, which contradicted the initial theory of complete incineration, the official stance of the Fayetteville Police and Fire Department remained stubbornly unchanged. They continued to adhere to the original narrative, established by Fire Chief Morris, insisting that the 5 children had perished in the blaze on Christmas Eve. The small charred bone fragments, the vertebrae, were eventually attributed to Maurice Sodder, the oldest of the missing children, as the age range matched his approximate age, or perhaps to one of the other children. However, the crucial question of why there were no other remains and why the recovered bones were only partially incinerated and so few in number was largely ignored or inadequately explained by the authorities. The rapid issuance of the death certificates immediately after the fire by the local coroner, based on the non-existent evidence of remains, remains one of the most troubling aspects of the initial investigation. These documents, signed and sealed just days after the tragedy, formally declared the 5 Sodder children deceased. This move, intended to provide the grieving parents with a sense of closure and allow for a formal burial, had the opposite effect on George and Jenny. They viewed the death certificates as a bureaucratic attempt to prematurely close a case that was clearly filled with profound anomalies and unanswered questions. George and Jenny adamantly refused to accept these documents. To them, accepting the certificates meant accepting a lie, betraying the memory of their children, and extinguishing the slim flame of hope that they were still alive. Their refusal to cooperate with this final step created a protracted legal and personal battle with the local authorities. The Sodders spent years attempting to have the death certificates rescinded, or at least officially reviewed, arguing that without the physical bodies, the documentation was fraudulent and based on pure conjecture. They believed the fire chief and the local police were either grossly incompetent or, worse, actively complicit in a cover-up designed to protect those responsible for the crime. This suspicion was deepened by the fact that the authorities never fully pursued any of George's theories regarding the cut phone line, the disabled trucks, or the missing ladder, treating the incident as a solved accidental death rather than a potential mass kidnapping. The entire process of the official conclusion demonstrated a severe breakdown in trust between the community's prominent family and its law enforcement. The police's failure to properly search the scene, their refusal to acknowledge the contradictory forensic evidence found years later, and their reliance on a highly improbable theory of total incineration solidified George and Jenny's certainty that their children had not died in the fire. The paper documentation of their children's deaths became the physical symbol of the systemic injustice and investigative malpractice they would fight against for the rest of their lives. The children were declared dead on paper, but in the hearts and minds of their parents, the possibility of life, however remote, was kept alive by the very incompetence of the investigation that had sought to close the door. The aftermath of the Christmas Eve fire was not just a period of mourning for George and Jenny Sodder. It was the beginning of an all-consuming, decades-long obsession that defined the rest of their lives. They fundamentally rejected the notion that their 5 children had perished, treating the lack of remains not as proof of death, but as concrete evidence of a kidnapping. This unhearing belief led them to pour every available resource, emotional and financial, into a tireless private investigation that spanned nearly 50 years and cost them a substantial fortune, estimated at over $1 million in old money, a staggering sum for the time. Their life became a relentless, painful quest. They never moved from Fayetteville, choosing instead to build a fence around the ruins of the fire, turning the site into a permanent shrine and a constant reminder of their missing children. They erected a large billboard on Route 60, the main highway running through the town. This billboard, painted bright green and yellow, featured large, prominent photographs of the 5 missing children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Long, with a clear, bold message promising a substantial reward for any information leading to their discovery. This act was not merely an appeal for help. It was a defiant, public declaration of their refusal to accept the official closure of the case. The billboard stood for decades, becoming a landmark for travelers and a lasting symbol of the family's agony and relentless hope, ensuring that the tragedy was never forgotten by the wider public. Jenny Sodder, in particular, was tormented by the smallest details of the fire and the subsequent investigation. She refused to throw away the ashes and debris from the house, meticulously sorting through the charred remnants for years, looking for any overlooked piece of bond, fabric, or even a toy that might have survived the blaze. Her nights were filled with terrible nightmares, and her days were spent analyzing and reanalyzing the events, always returning to the same conclusions: the pre-dawn phone call, the open door, the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, and the cut phone line. She developed a profound spiritual certainty that the children were alive, a conviction that strengthened with every failed official explanation. The remaining children, especially Sylvia, who was only 2 years old at the time of the fire, grew up under the shadow of the disappearance. Sylvia never knew her 5 oldest siblings, yet their absence was the central fact of her childhood. She slept in the same house that replaced the burned one, lived across from the constant reminder of the billboard, and was raised in a household where the hope of finding the missing children was prioritized above all else. This collective trauma bonded the remaining family members, turning their private grief into a public, enduring crusade for justice and truth. They all understood that for George and Jenny, the end of the search would only come with the discovery of the children, either a lifeway or with definitive physical proof of their deaths. Until then, their life was an open-ended chapter, a long, agonizing wait for a resolution that never seemed to arrive, forcing them to live indefinitely in the space between mourning and waiting. The Sodder case transcends a simple accidental house fire because of the sheer number of inexplicable anomalies that occurred before, during, and after the blaze, all of which pointed toward premeditation and a sinister plot. For George and Jenny, these unusual occurrences were not mere coincidences, but the deliberate orchestration of a coup. Analyzing these details reveals why they were so certain their children were kidnapped, and why the case remains open in the public's eye. Firstly, the pre-fire indicators were too specific to be random. The mysterious phone call in the dead of night, where a strange woman asked for an unknown person with the sound of laughter in the background, was classic misdirection. Jenny was awakened and pulled out of her bedroom. Following this, she found the front door unlocked and wide open, which she always securely fastened, suggesting an intruder had gained access to the first floor to carry out initial actions before the main event. Secondly, the sabotage of rescue efforts was meticulously planned. George's two large, powerful coal trucks failed to start simultaneously, despite being meticulously maintained and working fine hours earlier. This failure was crucial, as the trucks were George's only means of quickly reaching the second-floor windows. Compounding this, the house ladder was missing from its usual spot. George found this heavy ladder was later discovered discarded in a ravine 75 feet away, indicating it was intentionally removed to guarantee that George could not execute an immediate rescue attempt. The fire was not just an accident. It was an entrapment. Thirdly, the failure of communication and the fire's origin raised alarm bells. The family's home telephone line was cut clean outside, not burned, precluding the possibility of a swift emergency call, further suggesting pre-planned sabotage. George strongly suspected an incendiary device was thrown onto the roof, accounting for the thud and rolling sound Jenny heard, and the fire starting intensely near the roofline, not the chimney, or a faulty flue as the authorities initially claimed. Finally, the lack of physical evidence was the most damning point. The fire chief's conclusion of complete incineration was medically and forensically improbable. George argued that the fire was not hot enough to vaporize 5 human bodies, pointing to the recovered metal springs of the children's mattresses and the intact cast-iron stove. The subsequent discovery of partial charred human remains years later proved that the children had not been completely consumed, further validating George's skepticism and suggesting that if one child's partial remains were found, the other 4 were physically elsewhere. These accumulated points of suspicion, misdirection, disabled rescue, communication failures, and forensic impossibilities transformed the Sodder case from a simple tragedy into a complex theory of organized kidnapping and arson. The hypothesis that the Sodder house fire was an act of arson deliberately set to cover up a kidnapping is perhaps the most compelling theory, sustained by the evidence that the official investigation dismissed. George and Jenny Sodder firmly believed the fire was not an accident, but a premeditated, malicious act, and they had several key pieces of circumstantial evidence to support this dark conclusion. The first piece of evidence supporting arson was the location and intensity of the fire's origin. Fire Chief Morris suggested faulty wiring or a defective chimney. However, George strongly argued that the fire started not at the base of the chimney, but high up near the roof and the telephone wire entrance, the exact area where Jenny heard the loud thud and rolling noise just before the blaze. George believed this sound was an incendiary device thrown onto the roof, designed to start a fire quickly and intensely from an unequal spot. This would explain the rueful, almost explosive spread of the flames that George witnessed upon waking, consuming the upstairs so quickly that rescue was impossible. A typical electrical fire usually starts slow and builds, often from the ground up, but this fire appeared to start and consume the structure with an unnerving immediate ferocity. Secondly, the evidence of disabled systems pointed to a planned operation. The phone line was cut clean, not burned through, an act of sabotage designed to prevent the family from calling for help. More importantly, the simultaneous failure of both large work trucks strongly suggested tampering. George consulted mechanics who suggested that the truck's engines could have been easily disabled by placing a foreign object in the fuel line, or simply cutting a crucial wire X that require only a few minutes of clandestine work. These acts of sabotage were not related to the electrical system of the house, but were deliberate measures taken to trap the victims and prevent George, the strong and capable father, from mounting a rescue. Thirdly, the prior threat to the family lent credence to the malice aforethought. George had been openly critical of fascist Italy and was rumored to have had confrontations with local figures who had ties to organized crime or old world grudges. Weeks before the fire, an insurance salesman had visited the home and, after an argument with George, made a veiled phrase, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed." When George challenged him, the salesman chillingly added, "In the course of the next 2 weeks, your house will be gone." This threat, coupled with the methodical sabotage, transformed the fire from a random tragedy into the chilling culmination of a personal or political vendetta, with the fire serving as the perfect cover for the true crime, the kidnapping of 5 children. The initial official conclusion of the fire being caused by faulty electrical wiring was a critical and convenient point that George Sodder aggressively disputed, pointing to evidence that suggested the electrical system was deliberately disabled or tampered with, rather than simply failing. His conviction stemmed from several key technical details and the timing of the failure. First and foremost was the condition of the telephone line. George and his sons carefully examined the wire that ran from the telephone pole to the house. They found that it was cut clean high up on the pole, well out of reach and away from the fire's epicenter. A fire would typically burn the insulation and fuse the wires, but the cut was precise and clearly made with a tool, such as wire cutters or pliers, indicating sabotage. The telephone line was dead before the fire intensified enough to affect the wiring inside the home, further proving the act was premeditated and not a consequence of the blaze. Secondly, the overall electrical system of the house itself had been recently inspected and updated. George, being a successful, practical businessman, was meticulous about maintenance and had ensured that the wiring was modern and safe. He had a strong technical understanding of how a typical electrical fire would manifest. When he found that the circuit breakers, which were designed to trip in the event of a short circuit or overload, had remained in the on position, it suggested that the fire's origin was external and not a simple, internal electrical fault. Thirdly, the sequential nature of the failures was too complex for a mere coincidence. The house lights had been strangely left on just before the fire, as Jenny observed. Then came the strange phone call, followed by the fire. Then the discovery of the cut phone line, and finally, the simultaneous failure of both massive work trucks. The person or persons responsible for the kidnapping and arson did not rely on a simple electrical fault. They took multiple steps to guarantee the outcome. They cut the communications, disabled the primary means of rescue, the ladder and the trucks, and then initiated the fire, which was likely fueled by an accelerant. Given its unusual intensity, this multi-layered sabotage, encompassing electrical, mechanical, and logistical failures, far exceeded the scope of a simple, tragic electrical fire, and pointed directly to a systematic, criminal plan. For the Sodders, the electrical system was not the cause of the fire. It was simply another component in their lives that was deliberately stylized by the perpetrator to ensure the cover-up was complete and the rescue was impossible. The most compelling and difficult evidence for the Sodders to dismiss came from numerous eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen the missing children not just before the fire, but after the house had been reduced to ashes, suggesting the official death narrative was a complete falsehood. These accounts, gathered both immediately after the event and in the following years, solidified George and Jenny's conviction that the children were alive and had been successfully taken. One of the first and most critical pieces of testimony came from a woman who was driving on the highway near Fayetteville in the early hours of Christmas morning, while the fire was still active. This woman stated she saw a group of 5 children and 4 adults traveling in a vehicle. Her description of the children matched the Sodder children's appearance, 3 boys and 3 girls of various ages. She told police that she had also noticed the vehicle contained 2 of George Sodder's large work trucks, which were inexplicably unable to start earlier, suggesting they had been towed or driven away from the scene after the fire was started. This testimony directly supported George's fear that the trucks had been tampered with and then recovered by the criminals. Another woman, who ran a roadside tourist court, located about 50 miles from Fayetteville, claimed she saw the children the morning after the fire. She testified that she served breakfast to the 5 Sodder children, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women. She specifically recalled the children because they looked tired and disheveled, and she overheard the adults speaking Italian and English interchangeably, an observation that directly connected them to George Sodder's Sardinian heritage and his family's Italian-American background. She even claimed that one of the adults, upon noticing her intense scrutiny of the children, looked hostilely at her and quickly covered the children's faces as they hurried them back into a vehicle. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from a man named Johnny Bobs. He was at a restaurant between Fayetteville and Charleston shortly after the fire and claimed he saw a vehicle containing the Sodder children. He remembered the children clearly and said they were being shuffled into a car by adults. He approached one of the men and asked about the children, but the man quickly dismissed him. Bobs later identified this man in a photo lineup as one of the individuals who had been involved in previous business disputes with George Sodder. This tied the disappearance not to a random tragedy, but to a potential vendetta carried out by known antagonists of the patriarch. The consistency and geographical dispersal of these sightings, all placing the children alive and traveling away from Fayetteville, provided George and Jenny with the lifelong hope that their missing children were indeed being held captive and not resting in the ashes of their home. The 2 large coal trucks owned by George Sodder were the first physical evidence George presented to the authorities as proof of sabotage, and the inability of these vehicles to start during the critical moments of the fire became a major point of contention. The official response initially was to dismiss the failure as a mechanical coincidence, exacerbated by the cold weather, a conclusion George found infuriating and logically unsound. George's core argument was that the trucks were meticulously maintained and had never given him simultaneous trouble before. The newest of the 2 trucks was a large, powerful vehicle that should have started reliably even in the December cold. George believed the trucks were deliberately rendered inoperable. He and his sons later examined the engines closely, and while George was not a professional mechanic, his extensive experience with heavy machinery led him to suspect that the engines had been tampered with. He speculated that a foreign object, perhaps a piece of metal or debris, had been intentionally introduced into the fuel line or carburetor of both trucks, or that crucial wires in the ignition system had been subtly cut or disconnected. This mechanical sabotage was directly linked to the eyewitness testimony that emerged in the following days and weeks. As noted, a woman driving that morning claimed to have seen a vehicle carrying the 5 children, and that this vehicle was accompanied by 2 of George Sodder's large work trucks. This account, if true, provided a terrifying explanation. The criminals had disabled the trucks to prevent George's rescue attempt, and then, after the fire was successfully set and the children removed, they towed or drove the valuable trucks away from the scene as part of their cover-up. The trucks were not simply broken. They were part of the crazy. The possibility of the trucks being driven or towed away also explains another piece of logistical planning by the perpetrators. Moving 2 large, distinct coal trucks would require significant resources, likely involving multiple accomplices and a heavy-duty towing vehicle, suggesting the kidnapping was an organized, well-financed operation, far beyond the capabilities of a single, opportunistic arsonist. George repeatedly pressured the local police to investigate the whereabouts of his trucks in the hours immediately following the fire, but this line of inquiry was quickly dismissed by the local authorities, further strengthening the Sodders' belief that the police were either willfully negligent or actively protecting the criminals involved in the plot. The story of the disabled trucks became a physical, tangible symbol of the methodical preparation involved in the crime. serving as a silent, metallic witness to the events of that devastating Christmas Eve. Facing the stonewalling and apparent apathy of the local authorities, George and Jenny Sodder realized very quickly that if they wanted answers, they would have to find them themselves. George used his considerable financial resources to hire several private investigators, PIs, over the years, transforming their personal grief into a professional cold case effort. These PIs were tasked with moving beyond the local narrative of accidental fire and pursuing the threads of kidnapping, vendetta, and organized crime that the police had ignored. One of the first and most persistent lines of inquiry pursued by the PIs was the pre-fire threat that George had received. George revealed that an insurance salesman, upon being denied George's business, had warned him weeks earlier that his house would go up in smoke and his children are going to be destroyed. The PIs managed to track down this individual, confirming his identity and existence. However, the man claimed the threat was simply a figure of speech meant to scare George into buying insurance, and the local police showed no interest in pursuing him as a genuine suspect or accomplice. The PIs, however, felt this was a crucial, overlooked piece of evidence establishing malice aforethought and providing a direct personal motive for the crime. Another PI focused heavily on the eyewitness accounts of the children being seen alive after the fire. They meticulously interviewed and re-interviewed the woman who ran the roadside court, the driver who saw the 2 trucks and 5 children, and the man named Johnny Bobs. The PIs found the witnesses' stories to be consistently credible, despite the passage of time. They particularly focused on Bobs's claim that he had identified one of the adults with the children as a man with whom George had previously had a severe business dispute. This solidified the Sodders' belief that the kidnapping was the result of a vendetta carried out by an individual with local ties and a clear personal motive against George. The private investigations were instrumental in pushing for a more scientific examination of the fire scene. It was the PIs, working with the Sodders' money, who contacted the state pathologist, Dr. Oscar B. Hunter, leading to the excavation of 1949 that unearthed the partial human remains. While this discovery confirmed one child's possible death, it also completely invalidated the official total incineration theory, providing George and Jenny with the moral and factual ammunition to continue their fight against the local government's conclusion. The private investigators successfully kept the case in the public eye, leveraging George's wealth and the national media's appetite for mystery, ensuring that the authorities could never fully dismiss the tragedy as a closed accidental case. The relentless pressure exerted by George and Jenny Sodder, coupled with the sensational nature of the case and the baffling contradictions in the local investigation, eventually forced the involvement of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. This intervention, sought by the Sodders and eventually sanctioned by the West Virginia state government, marked the first time the case was handled by a highly professional, objective law enforcement agency, lifting it from the hands of the local, allegedly incompetent authorities. In 1950, after years of private appeals and frustration, George Sodder traveled directly to Washington, D.C., pleading with federal officials to take over the investigation. The FBI, however, initially hesitated. Disappearances and arson were typically state and local matters, and the case lacked a clear federal jurisdiction. However, the unique circumstances, the suggestion of kidnapping across state lines, the massive destruction of property, and the high-profile media coverage eventually persuaded them. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover himself was reportedly moved by the parents' desperate appeal and the glaring anomalies in the official file. He authorized the FBI to enter the case, with the caveat that they could only offer assistance if the local police or state authorities formally requested it. Under immense public pressure, fueled by George's publicity efforts, the state of West Virginia finally issued the formal request. The FBI's involvement brought a new level of rigor and forensic science to the investigation. Though tragically, it came years too late, after the scene had been repeatedly disturbed and key evidence destroyed. The first major action taken by the FBI was to completely re-examine the ruins of the Sodder home. They were tasked with finding definitive proof of death, specifically any remaining bone fragments that the local police had missed, or a conclusive explanation for the partial remains found in the 1949 excavation. However, the late entry into the case severely hampered their efforts. The FBI agents noted that the site had been so thoroughly contaminated and disturbed by the previous clumsy investigations and the bulldozing by Fire Chief Morris that a pristine forensic recovery was impossible. Despite this setback, the FBI spent considerable time sifting through the debris and the surrounding area, but ultimately, they too failed to find any additional remains that could conclusively account for the 5 missing children. This finding did not, however, validate the total incineration theory. Instead, it confirmed the appalling inadequacy of the initial local response. The FBI's official report, while failing to solve the mystery, noted the suspicious nature of the mechanical and communicative failures, acknowledging the strong possibility of arson and kidnapping. Yet despite their best efforts, the lack of a clear jurisdiction or tangible federal leads, coupled with the contaminated evidence, eventually led the FBI to classify the case as an unsolved disappearance, turning the primary investigative responsibility back to the local authorities, who had already demonstrated their inability to handle it. The Sodder family's decades-long vigil was fueled by persistent hope, which was occasionally reignited by fleeting, yet tantalizing clues that appeared to confirm their conviction that the children were alive. The most significant and baffling of these clues arrived in 1968, 23 years after the fire, in the form of a mysterious postcard delivered to the Sodder home in Fayetteville. This postcard, which had been mailed from Central Florida, was addressed to Jenny Sodder. It was a cheaply made, generic piece of correspondence, but the message contained within was anything but generic. On the back, in handwriting that bore a striking resemblance to the young Louis Sodder's penmanship before the fire, was a cryptic message. The message, written in block letters, read, "Louis, I love brother Frankie. I do a little more." Louis, who would have been in his late 30s at the time, was one of the missing children, and the reference to brother Frankie was a clear nod to the Sodder family's internal dynamics, as Louis's middle name was Frank. The fact that the card mentioned such specific, internal family knowledge was immediately chilling and highly compelling to Jenny. However, the reverse side of the postcard held the most significant and shocking piece of information: a photograph. It was a snapshot of a young man, appearing to be in his late 20s or early 30s, dark-haired and intense, bearing an almost undeniable resemblance to George Sodder, particularly in the deep-set eyes and strong jawline. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo were the words, written in a different hand than the message: Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. I live in Florida. I miss my family. George and Jenny were instantly galvanized by this discovery. Jenny, upon seeing the photo, became emotionally convinced that this was her son Louis, grown into a man. The sheer specificity of the references, combined with the uncanny physical resemblance, made it impossible for them to dismiss it as a cruel prank. They immediately contacted the local police and the private investigators, demanding an immediate, thorough follow-up on the Florida lead. However, the local authorities, once again, showed extreme reluctance to cooperate. The police chief at the time dismissed the postcard as just another random, sick joke that the family had received over the years, a common occurrence given the massive billboard and the publicity surrounding the case. George and Jenny, however, refused to be deterred. They used their own funds to hire a new private detective, instructing him to travel to Central Florida to pursue the lead. The detective's instructions were simple: track down the postmark, locate the individual in the photograph, and bring Louis Sodder home. This was the first concrete, verifiable clue the family had received in over 2 decades, and they poured every ounce of their remaining hope into this single, grainy photograph and its cryptic message from a life lived far away. This discovery, which revived the possibility of a Christmas miracle, would lead to the final professional assessment of the children's fate, bringing the family closer to the truth than they had ever been, only to have the door slammed shut again by the complexity of the crime. The Sodder family's tireless pursuit of the truth uncovered a deeply disturbing fact about the original official conclusion. The very person who led the initial, flawed investigation, Fire Chief F.J. Morris, was himself implicated in a series of suspicious actions and statements that, for George and Jenny, pointed strongly toward a cover-up. The chief's hasty declaration of total incineration, followed by his reckless bulldozing of the fire site, which destroyed forensic evidence, made him an enduring antagonist in the Sodder saga. Years after the fire, Chief Morris's own actions brought a tragic and bizarre footnote to the case. Morris, the man who insisted the fire was accidental and the children were ashes, reportedly began to show signs of profound guilt or distress over the case. He confessed to a close acquaintance that he believed the fire was indeed deliberately set. Furthermore, he admitted that he had been ordered by someone to halt the investigation and quickly declare the children deceased, implying an external, powerful force was involved in manipulating the conclusion. This deathbed confession, or at least a strong implication of a cover-up, provided a terrifying validation of George and Jenny's decades-long suspicions. However, due to the nature of the statement and the lack of official record, it could not be used to overturn the legal status of the case. Compounding this was the discovery related to the remains found in the 1949 excavation. The pathologist, Dr. Oscar B. Hunter, concluded that the small fragments of vertebrae found were not the result of total incineration, but were merely charred. A further analysis of the remains led Dr. Hunter to a shocking conclusion. The small bones appeared to be uncremated human bones. This suggested that the bones, which were found deep in the soil beneath the house, must have been planted at the site before the fire, or possibly introduced during the fire's initial stages to leave behind just enough evidence to suggest a death by fire, thereby satisfying the legal requirement for a coroner's report and allowing the case to be closed. This new revelation transformed the Sodders' belief. If the bones were planted, it meant the perpetrators were not just kidnappers, but were cunning, meticulous criminals who understood the forensic requirements of a death investigation. The presence of partial, seemingly uncremated remains, paired with the complete absence of 4 other bodies, indicated a horrifying scenario. The 5 children were successfully abducted, and the fears was used as a distraction, with the small partial remains being a prop to confirm the narrative of death, ensuring the investigation would be closed and the pursuit of the children would cease. George and Jenny now had scientific evidence to prove the official story was a manufactured lie, solidifying their conviction that the original fire investigation had been fatally compromised from the very top. The official excavation, conducted in 1949, largely pressured by George Sodder and his private funding, was a critical moment that definitively shattered the initial official narrative, but ultimately failed to solve the disappearance. George, seeking forensic proof of his children's fate, convinced Dr. Oscar B. Hunter, a pathologist from a nearby medical college, to oversee a professional, scientific excavation of the fire site, digging deep into the contaminated soil of the cellar pit. The key outcome of this excavation was the discovery of several small, charred bone fragments, including fragments of human vertebrae. These bones were analyzed by Dr. Hunter, who delivered a conclusion that was both devastating for the official story and profoundly unsettling for the Sodder family. Dr. Hunter's findings proved that the local fire chief's insistence on complete incineration was false. The fire had clearly not been hot enough to fully consume human bodies, as evidenced by the mere charring of these remains. Furthermore, the pathologist estimated that the bones belonged to a single individual, a child between the ages of 9 and 15. However, the major unexpected result was the paucity of the remains. The recovered fragments were so few and so small that they accounted for only a minuscule portion of a single human skeleton. This raised the central unanswered question that plagued the case. If one child had died in the house, where were the bodies of the other 4? This extreme lack of remains, coupled with the proven fact that the fire was not hot enough to vaporize bones, strongly suggested that most of the children were not in the house when the fire reached its peak intensity. Adding to the mystery, some forensic experts later speculated that the bone fragments found were uncremated bones, meaning they had not been subjected to prolonged high-temperature heat. The shocking implication was that these bones could have been deliberately planted in the already dug-up soil beneath the house, either before or immediately after the fire. As a kind of forensic misdirection, this act would provide the authorities with just enough evidence, a single partial child's body, to confirm a death by fire and justify the issuance of the death certificates, thus ensuring the case was closed and the kidnapping of the remaining children went uninvestigated. For George and Jenny, the 1949 excavation only served to strengthen their conviction that they were fighting a massive orchestrated cover-up rather than a simple accident. Jenny Sodder, the matriarch, was the emotional engine of the family's decades-long search, driven by a profound maternal instinct that was constantly revalidated by the logical inconsistencies of the official report. Her perspective on the tragedy was not based on forensic science or legal statutes, but on an unwearying, visceral conviction that her children were alive. This belief stemmed directly from the string of bizarre events that preceded the fire. Jenny openly confessed to her remaining children and to the private investigators that she believed the entire incident was a calculated performance. She often recounted the sequence of events with painful clarity, always emphasizing the strange phone call she received late that night. To Jenny, the panicked yet laughing voice on the other end, asking for a person she didn't know, was not a random wrong number, but a deliberate distraction intended to pull her out of bed and confirm her location. When she hung up and found the front door open and the lights on, she concluded that the criminal or an accomplice had been inside the house, possibly planting an incendiary device or an accelerant to ensure the rapid spread of the fire, or perhaps even preparing the children for removal. Her belief in a kidnapping over a fire death was intensely personal and based on the physical reality of the recovered artifacts. She would repeatedly focus on the intact mattress springs and the metal coils found in the debris, asking the same heartbreaking question: how could 5 human bodies, flesh and bone, vanish into thin air when the metal they slept on was still there? This lack of complete incineration, coupled with the later discovery of only partial remains, led Jenny to the crushing realization that the fire was merely a diversionary tactic. She believed the 5 children were drugged or sedated to ensure their silence, and then physically removed from the house during the short window of time between the strange phone call and the fire's full consumption of the second floor. Jenny viewed the disabling of the trucks and the missing ladder as final, damning proof of premeditation. The culprits had ensured that George, the father, could not climb to the rescue, nor could he use his powerful vehicles to aid his efforts. She felt that the perpetrators had stripped the family of every viable means of fighting back or escaping. guaranteeing the success of their plan. For Jenny, the deepest part of the pain was the certainty that her children were out there, alive, possibly being held against their will or living new lives under assumed identities, and she felt the constant, aching responsibility to find them. Her life became a testament to a mother's refusal to accept an illogical, convenient truth, fueling a private war against the police, the fire chief, and the death certificates that dared to declare her baby's voodoo without proof. The most compelling and heart-wrenching twist in the Sodder mystery arrived in 1967, 22 years after the tragedy, with the discovery of the aforementioned postcard and the photograph it contained. This event, which felt like a moment of divine intervention, directly challenged the family's efforts to grieve and cemented their hope. The postcard, mailed from Central Florida, contained a message and a photograph that Jenny Sodder immediately believed was their son, Louis Sodder, who would have been around 32 years old at the time. The photograph showed a dark-haired young man with features that Jenny and George found strikingly similar to Louis, particularly the bone structure, the intense gaze of the eyes, and the overall family resemblance. The photo was a black and white headshot, deliberately posed to capture the subject's face clearly. Scrawled on the back of the photo were two key pieces of text. The first, written in block capital letters, stated, "Louis Sodder, and I live in Florida," along with a note of love for his brother Frankie. Louis's middle name was Frank. The second, a more cryptic line, was a personal message hinting at internal family knowledge that a prankster would not easily possess. For Jenny, this was the moment of confirmation she had waited for. Her son was alive, trying to communicate with them, but likely still under duress or threat, as the communication was veiled and sent anonymously. George and Jenny invested all their remaining resources into validating this single piece of evidence. They immediately sent their best private investigator to Central Florida with the postcard and the photograph, instructing him to spare no expense in tracking down the sender. George and Jenny clung to the belief that Louis was working as a traveling salesman or was involved in a profession that required him to move frequently, which would explain why he hadn't been found earlier. They believed the message was a desperate attempt to break free from his captors or new guardians. However, the pursuit of this clue was met with a wall of silence. Despite months of intensive work, the private investigator was unable to locate the specific person in the photograph, nor could he definitively trace the postmark to an exact location or sender. The anonymity of the postcard, combined with the 2-decade head start the kidnappers had, proved an insurmountable obstacle. The local Florida authorities, when informed of the Sodder family's decades-old kidnapping claim, were initially skeptical and slow to cooperate, viewing the case as a fantastical pursuit of an old, presumed dead victim. In their desperation, George and Jenny had a large reproduction of the photograph included on their Route 16 billboard, right alongside the original pictures of the missing children. The message below the new photo was simple and direct. "Louis, if this is you, please contact us." The act was an open plea and a defiant challenge to the person in the photo and whoever might be holding him. The Sodders had effectively turned their billboard into a public missing persons alert that updated in real time, proclaiming their conviction to the world. Louis Sodder was alive, residing in Florida, and was trying to return home. The photograph of the young man, allegedly Louis Sodder, sent to Jenny and George in 1967, was the final and most heartbreaking piece of evidence that the family pursued. Recognizing the immense stakes, the potential end of their 22-year search, George arranged for a professional, forensic analysis of the photograph and the associated handwriting. He wanted definitive, scientific proof that the man in the picture was, or was not, their missing son. George hired a renowned private detective, who in turn enlisted the services of a forensic document expert and a photographic analyst. The document expert meticulously compared the block lettering on the postcard, which resembled Lewis's known early handwriting, against known samples of the missing boy's script. The results were inconclusive regarding the writer's identity, but highly suggestive of a family connection. The expert noted that the handwriting exhibited certain unique flourishes and letter formations that were consistent with someone who had been taught to write in the Sodder household, or by someone very close to the family. This implied the writer was either Lewis himself or someone who knew the family's writing habits intimately, which was consistent with a kidnapping plot where the children might be raised by new but familiar guardians. The photographic analyst focused on the image itself, seeking to definitively link the man to Lewis Sodder based on physical markers and aging patterns. This analysis involved detailed measurements of facial features, bone structure, and the comparison of the man's adult features to the childhood photos of Louis. The analyst concluded that there was an extremely high probability that the man in the 1967 photograph was indeed the adult Louis Sodder. The striking resemblance in the eyes, the chin line, and the set of the mouth, when projected onto the aging trajectory of a boy who was 10 at the time of the fire, were all deemed consistent with a biological match. However, despite these compelling yet circumstantial findings, the forensic analysis faced a critical limitation: the quality of the evidence. The postcard was cheap, and the photograph was a grainy, low-resolution snapshot, making a definitive, incontestable fingerprint analysis or DNA comparison impossible at the time. Furthermore, the anonymity of the sender meant that even with a strong probability of a match, the investigators had no way to locate the man, to obtain a current photograph, or a biological sample for confirmation. When George presented these results, and the strong probability of a match, to the FBI and the local police, he was once again met with a lack of enthusiasm. The authorities argued that high probability was not conclusive proof, and without a physical location or a witness willing to come forward, the lead remained effectively cold. George and Jenny, however, accepted the forensic assessment as their personal truth. The photograph was the closest they ever came to finding their son, and it fueled their final years with a profound, agonizing certainty. Louis was alive. He was trying to reach them, and they were heartbreakingly close to bringing him home. The enduring legacy of the Sodder disappearance is one of unwearying parental love, pitted against systemic failure and ambiguity. For George and Jenny Sodder, the search for their 5 children became the defining purpose of their lives, transforming their family tragedy into an American legend and a textbook East case. The most powerful symbol of their relentless pursuit was the billboard George erected on Route 16 in Fayetteville. This massive, prominent sign, featuring the faces of the 5 missing children and a clear, substantial reward offer, was maintained by the family for decades, standing as a constant public accusation against the local authorities and a defiant beacon of hope. The billboard was updated over the years, most notably with the photograph of the adult man, believed to be Louis Sodder, ensuring the case never faded from public consciousness. George Sodder, driven by his self-made business success, channeled his resources into this quest, estimating that he spent over $1 million, a monumental sum, in mid-20th century terms, on private investigators, forensic analysis, and the sustained publicity campaign. This financial commitment demonstrated his complete rejection of the fire-death theory and his absolute certainty that his children were victims of a kidnapping for vendetta plot. He died in 1968, never knowing the true fate of his children, his last years consumed by the uncertainty and the pain of the Lewis photograph. After George's death, Jenny Sodder and her remaining children, particularly her daughter Sylvia, who was the youngest and never met her siblings, took up the mantle. Jenny continued the decades-long vigil, tending the shrine at the fire site and maintaining the massive billboard until the late 1989, nearly 44 years after the fire. She passed away in 1989, taking her unanswered questions and her firm conviction that her children were alive to her grave. The family's efforts successfully changed the narrative from a simple, tragic fire to a complex, unsolved kidnapping. The ultimate reward offered by the family, though constantly updated, remained in the six-figure range, establishing the Sodder disappearance as one of the largest and most persistent private missing persons rewards in American history. Even after the deaths of George and Jenny, the surviving Sodder siblings and their descendants continued to investigate and seek the truth, refusing to officially close the book on the 5 children who vanished on Christmas Eve. The case is a grim testament to the fact that money and decades of effort cannot always defeat a meticulously planned crime shrouded in institutional failure. The tragic disappearance of the 5 Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, on Christmas Eve 1945, remains a chilling and active symbol of an unsolved mystery transcending the typical definition of a cold case. The sheer weight of contradictory evidence and the institutional failure to conduct a proper investigation have left the Sodder family and the public with an enduring set of unanswered questions. The conclusion of this story is not a resolution, but a collection of profound, agonizing unknowns that solidified George and Jenny's conviction until their last breath. The most critical question remains the simplest. Did the children die in the fire, or were they successfully kidnapped? The forensic evidence strongly argues against the official conclusion of total incineration. The discovery of only a few charred bone fragments, and the pathologist's assessment that the fire was not hot enough to fully consume 5 bodies, means that the majority of the children were almost certainly not in the house when the fire reached its peak. This scientific impossibility directly supports the family's theory that the fire was merely an elaborate cover-up for a meticulously planned abduction. The second major question is, who was responsible and why? The evidence points toward a vendetta, or an organized crime plot, targeting George Sodder for his outspoken political views or his business success. The deliberate disabling of the 2 coal trucks, the cutting of the phone line, the missing ladder, and the alleged planting of partial remains all suggest a sophisticated operation involving multiple accomplices. The motive likely lay in the conflicts George had with local figures, or perhaps a desperate attempt to extort money, or even a horrific act of retaliation related to his strong anti-fascist stances. The third and most heartbreaking question revolves around the Louis Sodder photograph. Was the man in the 1967 photograph, sent from Florida, actually the adult Louis? The forensic analysis provided a high probability of a match, but without a definitive, conclusive identification, the family could never act. If it was Louis, where were the other 4 children? And why did he only reach out with such a cryptic, veiled message? The picture serves as the ultimate piece of circumstantial evidence, validating the family's hope that the children were alive, but simultaneously creating an insurmountable wall of anonymity that prevented any physical reunion. After the deaths of both George in 1968 and Jenny in 1989, the surviving Sodder children, particularly Sylvia, continued the fight. Believing their siblings were still alive somewhere, they maintained the public pressure, though the famous billboard was eventually taken down after Jenny's passing. The case officially remains an unsolved disappearance, standing as a stark, terrible reminder that sometimes the true crime is not just the act itself, but the failure of the justice system to acknowledge and pursue the truth. The 5 Sodder children remain perpetually woven in time, eternally 10, 8, 12, and 14 years old. A Christmas miracle lost to the cold, hard questions that continue to echo across the Appalachian Mountains.